The night was heavy, dark, and merciless, stretching across the plains like an endless sea of shadows. The wind whispered through the skeletal remains of dry grass, carrying with it the scent of iron, dust, and something far more sinister, the lingering promise of danger. Far in the distance, a train moved steadily through the blackness, its wheels grinding on the rails, a steel heartbeat echoing across the barren land. Inside one of its cars, a woman sat trembling. Her clothes were torn, her hands raw and aching, from the ropes that bound them. Her hair clung to her sweat-streaked face, her eyes wide, darting in every direction, as though the very walls of the car were closing in on her. Every rattle, every jolt of the train made her flinch, as if the metal beast beneath her had become a living predator. She did not know why she was here. She did not know why the men had spoken those cruel words, those final accusations, before shoving her toward the door. All she remembered was the shock of betrayal, the faces she had trusted, now twisted with contempt. And then, in a moment that would haunt her forever, the door lurched open, and she was thrown into the cold night, flailing through the air before crashing against the earth. Pain shot through her body like lightning, her breath stolen by the wind, her limbs refusing to obey. The stars above spun like cruel eyes, indifferent to her suffering. For a long moment she lay there, broken and unable to move, listening to the fading echo of the train, to the emptiness of the desert around her. Every instinct screamed at her, to run, to hide, to disappear into the darkness. But her body would not respond. And then, a sound. Faint at first, almost swallowed by the wind, but growing steadily. A hoofbeat, steady and determined, approaching through the night. He appeared, as if summoned by the very desperation of the world. A rancher, a man who had spent years in solitude, tending to the land and animals, his face lined with the stories of years untouched by companionship. He dismounted swiftly, his eyes immediately finding her frail form on the ground. There was no hesitation. He bent down, lifting her with hands strong enough to carry her weight, yet gentle enough not to hurt her further. She whimpered, startled by his touch, unsure if this man was a savior or another threat. "You're safe now," he murmured, his voice low, steady, carrying a calmness that seemed to pull the terror from her chest. "I've got you." She could not answer. Her throat felt raw, her lungs tight, her body shaking in ways that went beyond cold. But something in the tone of his words, something in the certainty of his gaze, whispered to her that perhaps, just perhaps, she might survive. This night, he carried her to a horse waiting nearby, a large, dark creature with eyes reflecting the faint starlight. Carefully, he placed her across the saddle, wrapping her in a blanket he had draped over it beforehand. His hands lingered for a moment, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, offering comfort in a world that had shown her none. The ride to the ranch was long and silent. The wind bit at their faces, but neither spoke. She rested her head against the warmth of the blanket, listening to the rhythmic pounding of the horse's hooves, feeling the steady strength of the rancher beside her. Each mile they traveled pulled her further from the danger she had narrowly escaped, yet the shadows of her past clung to her, whispering doubts and fears. By the time they reached the ranch, the first tendrils of dawn were creeping across the horizon, casting pale, golden light over the wooden fences and open fields. He laid her down gently on a makeshift bed inside the barn, tucking the blanket around her shoulders. She looked up at him, eyes wary, a flicker of hope struggling to emerge from the ashes of despair. "You'll be safe here," he said softly, almost to himself. "I'll see to it." And for the first time that night, amidst the harshness of the world and the cruelty she had endured, she felt the faintest whisper of trust. She did not yet know his name. She did not yet know if she could believe in anyone again. But she felt the certainty that, for at least this one moment, there was someone who would not abandon her, someone who would fight the darkness for her, someone who would see her not as a burden, but as a life worth saving. The wind outside continued to howl, indifferent and eternal, but inside that small barn, under the shelter of his care, she closed her eyes, letting herself rest, if only for a while, and for the first time in hours, allowed herself to believe that she might live. The first light of dawn spilled through the cracks of the barn, painting the dusty wooden walls with pale gold. The wind outside had softened, carrying only the quiet whispers of the plains, the occasional call of a distant bird, and the soft rustle of grass swaying under the gentle morning sun. Inside, the woman stirred. Her body ached, her muscles stiff from the long frozen night. She opened her eyes slowly, unsure at first if the safety she felt was real, or merely another cruel trick of her mind. The rancher was already awake, tending to his chores as he had done for countless mornings. His movements were deliberate, quiet, as though he feared disturbing the fragile balance of the moment. When he noticed her stirring, he set down the bucket of water he had been carrying and approached her with a calm, steady patience. "You're awake," he said softly. "Good, that's a start." Her lips parted, but no words came. She only nodded slightly, wary. He did not rush her, did not demand answers or explanations. Instead, he guided her gently to sit upright, supporting her as she flexed stiff limbs, letting the pain and fear linger, but never taking over completely. Over the next hours, he offered her food, a small portion of bread and stew, warmed over a fire that crackled in the hearth. She accepted it slowly, almost suspiciously, as though every act of kindness might hide a trap. Yet the warmth of the meal seeped into her, filling not only her empty stomach but also the hollow spaces left by fear and betrayal. She began to realize that here, at least, the world's cruelty had not followed her. He worked silently beside her, repairing fences, feeding the horses, carrying water from the nearby stream. He never demanded her help, yet he did not keep her, at a distance either. Slowly, she began to imitate his movements, handing him a bucket, brushing down a horse's coat, carrying wood for the fire. Each small act became a thread, weaving a fragile connection between two souls who had known only isolation. The days stretched into nights, each one carrying its own rhythm of survival and quiet companionship. She learned the sound of the wind in the rafters, the way the horses nickered when they sensed danger, and the subtle nuances of the rancher's movements, how his hands trembled slightly when lifting the heavier buckets, how his jaw tightened whenever he surveyed the land, and how his eyes softened when he looked at her. She began to speak in fragments, at first hesitant, revealing nothing of her past, nothing of the danger she had narrowly escaped. He listened, without pressure, allowing silence to speak as loudly as words ever could. And in that silence, a trust began to grow, a trust built not on promises, but on small, undeniable acts of care. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows, across the fields a sudden storm rolled in. Dark clouds swallowed the sky and the wind rose, howling like a beast awakened from slumber. Horses whinnied in panic, and rain began to lash against the wooden roof. She froze, panic threatening to overtake her, memories of the train and betrayal clawing back into her mind. He found her standing in the doorway of the barn, trembling, soaked, and whispered, "Stay close. Don't look away. We'll get through this." Together they worked to secure the animals, to protect the barn from the fury of the storm. He handed her rope, guided her hands, and in the act of working side by side, the terror began to recede. She discovered strength in herself she had not known existed, and the presence of the rancher gave her courage to face what had once seemed insurmountable. When the storm passed, leaving the air clean and cool, they stood outside, breathing in the scent of wet earth and freedom. She looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time allowed herself to feel something she had long denied: hope. Not the fragile, fleeting kind, but a deeper, steadier ember, warm enough to ignite a new sense of possibility. That night, she lay by the fire, wrapped in a blanket he had prepared for her. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across her face, illuminating the lines of weariness, but also the faintest hint of peace. She thought of the train, of the night she had almost died, and realized that something extraordinary had happened. She had survived, not by her own cunning or strength, but by the simple, steadfast kindness of another human being. And as she drifted into sleep, she heard the rancher's steady breathing from the corner of the barn, and for the first time, she did not feel alone. Days passed, each one a quiet echo of the one before, yet each carrying a weight, a subtle shift that neither of them could name. The plains stretched endlessly under the sun, golden and unforgiving, but within the boundaries of the ranch, life moved with a rhythm all its own. She awoke each morning to the soft light spilling over the horizon, painting the fields in colors so bright and alive they almost seemed unreal after the darkness she had endured. The rancher was already awake when she stirred, the smell of fresh hay and the faint smoke of the fire greeting her senses. She watched him for a moment, silent, studying the lines of his face, the set of his shoulders, the way his hands moved with a quiet purpose born of years of toil. He caught her gaze and offered a small nod, a gesture that carried more reassurance than words ever could. Together they tended the animals. She learned the nuances of their care, the way a horse could sense fear, the gentleness needed to calm a skittish cow, the patience required to feed a stubborn goat. She faltered sometimes, dropping a pail, startling a horse. But he never chastised her. He guided her patiently, letting her discover her strength in her own time. They began to speak, more slowly at first. Words that were cautious, deliberate, revealing nothing of the past, but forming the foundations of trust. She learned his routines, his habits, his silences, and in return, he learned hers, the way she flinched at sudden noises, the quiet tremor in her hands when she laughed, the way her eyes lingered on the horizon, as though searching for something she could not yet name. One evening, as the sun began to dip behind the distant hills, painting the sky in streaks of amber and crimson, they paused together by the fence. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the faint scent of rain, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. She laughed softly at something he said, a quiet, unguarded sound that surprised even her. He smiled, a rare, genuine smile, and in that moment the distance between them shrank. They were no longer just two survivors sharing space. They were companions, bound by shared labor, shared silence, and the subtle, unspoken understanding that each was no longer entirely alone. But the West was never truly kind. One morning, distant voices drifted across the fields, shouts, the sound of hooves pounding against the earth. She froze, a cold dread sinking into her chest, memories of betrayal and abandonment clawing their way back to the surface. He noticed, immediately, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "Stay here," he said softly, though his voice carried the weight of command. "I'll handle it." She watched from the barn as he moved to confront the strangers, tall figures on horseback, their intent unreadable in the morning haze. Her heart raced, a mixture of fear and something else. Trust, fragile but growing. She realized in that moment that she did not want to be alone again. Not after the way he had stood by her, not after the way his presence had become a shield against a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. The strangers passed without incident, but the moment left its mark. She and the rancher returned to the fields, moving together in a comfortable silence. They shared a meal later, sitting close by the fire, their hands brushing occasionally, a fleeting contact that spoke volumes more than words ever could. In the quiet of the evening under a sky strewn with stars, she felt a sense of belonging she had not known since childhood. a sense that perhaps, finally, she had found a place in the world, and a person who would fight to keep her safe. Time passed, each day blending into the next, yet with each moment, the bond between them deepened. He shared small pieces of his life, the loss he had endured, the solitude he had grown accustomed to, the quiet ache of a heart untouched for too long. She listened, offering empathy where she could, her own fears and scars still unspoken but softened by his presence. And though neither spoke of the past that haunted her, the shared rhythm of work, survival, and quiet companionship became a language of its own, a language of trust, of understanding, of connection forged in the wild and untamed heart of the West. As night fell, she sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker, feeling the warmth on her face. Outside, the wind carried the distant howl of a coyote, a reminder that danger was never far. Yet inside, there was a fragile peace, a sense of safety born from the knowledge that she was no longer entirely alone. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself imagine a future where fear no longer dictated her every move, a future where she could laugh without flinching, where she could trust without hesitation. And for the first time since that night on the train, she believed that such a future might actually be possible. The ranch lay quiet under the soft glow of morning, the sun rising slowly over the endless plains, painting everything in hues of gold and amber. The wind carried the familiar scent of earth and grass, a comfort that masked the unease lingering just beyond the horizon. She moved through the barn, tending to the animals with a steadier hand now, yet there was a weight in her eyes, a shadow she could not shake. He noticed the subtle changes, the way she hesitated before speaking, the brief flinch when a branch snapped, the distant stare toward the horizon as though expecting something unseen. He said nothing at first, giving her space, knowing from years of solitude that trust could not be forced, only earned. But one evening, as the sun dipped low, setting the sky ablaze with streaks of crimson and gold, she finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, trembling with the weight of long-held fear. I wasn't always like this, she began, eyes downcast. I had a life before the train. People I trusted. People who wanted to see me disappear. I can't tell you everything. Not yet. But you need to know. I wasn't just unlucky. I was hunted. He listened in silence, the firelight reflecting in his eyes, steady and unwavering. He said nothing, allowing her to unravel her story at her own pace, knowing that her truth would come in time. She spoke of betrayal, of faces that had once promised safety turning against her, of narrow escapes and nights spent hiding in shadows, running from people who wanted to erase her existence. Every word was heavy with pain, yet her voice grew steadier as she spoke, as though unburdening herself in his presence was a balm to the wounds no one else had seen. And he, for his part, shared pieces of his life too. Stories of loss, of solitude, of the harshness of the land, and the emptiness that had defined his existence. There was no judgment, no pity, only the simple acknowledgement of survival in a world that often demanded cruelty as payment. Their connection deepened in ways neither had anticipated. Words were no longer the only language between them. A touch, a glance, a shared moment of quiet became enough to communicate trust, understanding, and the fragile beginnings of attachment. But peace, as always in the West, was fleeting. One evening, as the shadows grew long and the air turned chill, a distant sound carried across the plains, the unmistakable sound of hooves racing against the earth. Her chest tightened, a cold dread seeping into her bones. Memories of the train, of betrayal, of running and hiding resurfaced with terrifying clarity. He placed a firm hand on her shoulder, grounding her in the present. "Stay here," he said, calmly, though the tension in his jaw betrayed the alertness beneath. "I'll handle it." From the barn, she watched him step into the fading light, confronting the approaching figures. Her heart pounded, a mixture of fear and a strange, steadying trust. She realized in that moment that she relied on him not just for survival, but for safety, for guidance, for the fragile comfort of knowing someone would not abandon her. The strangers passed without incident, but the tension lingered. She could feel it in the air, a subtle promise that danger was never truly gone. That night, she sat by the fire, letting the warmth seep into her bones, and she realized something she had not allowed herself to feel before, a sense of belonging. The rancher's presence, steady and unwavering, was more than protection. It was a tether to a life she had thought lost forever. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she might laugh without fear, where she might trust without hesitation, where she might stand beside someone not as a burden, but as an equal, as a companion, as a person finally allowed to exist without running. And though the shadows of her past still lingered, dark and persistent, she felt a spark of hope. A spark that whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, the world could be different. If only for them, here, in this small corner of the relentless West. The first light of dawn broke over the plains, soft and golden, but the calm of the morning belied the tension that had been building for days. The air carried the faint scent of rain and the earthy musk of the fields, but beneath it lay a sharper tang, the sense that something inevitable was approaching, something that would demand courage, strength, and unity. She moved quietly through the barn, tending to the animals with a practiced hand now, her movements fluid, confident. The fear that had once defined her every gesture had softened, replaced by a cautious determination, a sense that she belonged somewhere, with someone. And yet, the unease in the air reminded her that the past had not yet fully released its grip. He appeared beside her without a sound, as if summoned by instinct. His eyes met hers, steady and unyielding, and in that look was a promise. No matter what came, she would not face it alone. "They're coming," he said simply. "No panic, only resolve. Stay here. Don't move. Trust me." Her heart pounded. A mixture of fear and something new, trust. She had learned now that fear alone could not dictate her choices. She nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the table, feeling the weight of all the days and nights that had led her here. The train, the fall, the long ride to the ranch, the care, the work, the trust, slowly built like fragile scaffolding in the wind. Outside, shadows moved across the fields, figures on horseback, their intentions clear in the way they approached with purpose. He stepped into the open, standing tall, his presence commanding, the weight of his experience radiating from every movement. The confrontation was swift, decisive. He met them with courage, honed by years of solitude and survival, defending not just himself, but her, the fragile life he had chosen to protect. She watched from the doorway, the familiar tremor of fear in her chest now tempered by a new strength. She realized she could face danger not as a victim, but as someone who had survived, someone who had found a tether to courage in the unlikeliest of places. The encounter passed, the threat neutralized, leaving only the echoes of hooves fading into the distance. He returned to her, eyes softened, but vigilant. "It's over," he said. And though her heart still raced, she knew it was true. For now, the danger had passed, and they were safe together. That evening, as the sun dipped, low over the horizon, painting the ranch in hues of gold and crimson, they sat together by the fire. The air was filled with the quiet hum of the night, the gentle whisper of wind through the trees, the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. She looked at him, truly looked, and saw not just a protector, but a companion, a witness to her survival. a fellow soul who had found meaning in her presence. I never thought I could feel safe again, she whispered, voice trembling yet steady. Not after everything, but here, with you, I do. He reached out, hand brushing hers, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had forged. You're not alone anymore. Not ever again. The days that followed were quiet, yet vibrant with life. She moved through the ranch with confidence, helping with chores, tending the animals, walking the fields with him. Their routines, once solitary and empty, were now shared, filled with laughter, conversation, and the simple joys of companionship. And as night fell, they stood together outside, watching the stars blink awake in the vast sky above. The wind carried a sense of eternity, of possibility. She smiled, a real, unguarded smile, feeling for the first time that she belonged, that she had a home, that she had found a life worth fighting for. The plains stretched endlessly before them, still wild and untamed, but within the boundaries. Of the ranch, a small corner of the world had been transformed. Fear had been met with courage. Isolation had been met with connection. And in that transformation, they had found something rare, something profound, hope, trust, and the promise of a new beginning together. The fire crackled, the wind whispered, and for the first time since the night she fell from the train, she closed her eyes with peace, knowing that whatever the world outside might bring, here she was no longer alone.